Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today I've got something that I think is going to be interesting for you, which is a comparison and shootout of 4 non-Delta Sigma DACs. If you're not familiar with the term Delta Sigma, it refers to the processing method of many DACs on the market from brands like Topping, SMSL, Jashelli Labs, many of the Schiit DACs. And generally speaking, what they're doing is taking a chip from a brand like ESS or AKM, plugging that into their circuit board and creating a Delta Sigma DAC. What Delta Sigma DACs do is they take the incoming signal, they convert them from a multi-bit signal, like say a 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit signal, they convert that to a 1-bit or a multi-bit signal with a few bits, and they process the sound that way. So there's a lot of oversampling or upsampling being done internally by the DACs. And the results can be fantastic at times, they can also be underwhelming at times, but there's lately been a bit of a resurgence in non-Delta Sigma approaches, including mostly R2R DACs, but also Schiit's multibit approach come into that as well. And so what these DACs are doing is that instead of converting the signal that comes in into a completely different format, they're essentially working with the data that comes in, processing it as it is. They might do some oversampling, but they're not converting it into a Delta Sigma approach. And so this review is specifically focused on 4 DACs on the market, each at different price levels, that don't use a Delta Sigma approach, and therefore processing the signal using an R2R approach, which is using a ladder of resistors to convert the signal, or it's using Schiit's multibit approach. I'm not going to go into depth here about how Schiit's multibit approach works, but it's kind of like an R2R DAC built on a chip. And so I was curious to know, and hopefully you are too, whether or not the chip-based multibit approach used by Schiit is comparable, better than, different to the R2R approach used by DACs like the musician Pegasus here and also the Denafrips Pontus II. Now I know this has been a long intro, but there's just a couple more things I need to mention. And that is that this review has only been possible because channel patron and viewer Michael was kind enough to lend me his Denafrips Pontus II for this review. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Michael. For those of you that have wanted me to review the Pontus II for a long time, maybe drop a thanks to Michael down in the comments below. And then the other thing I want to mention is about the Pegasus up here. Musicians sent me the Pegasus quite some time ago now. We're going probably way back 6 months or so. They sent me the Pegasus, I hooked it up, I started to use it, and it had some kind of power failure. I reached out to Musician to get some help. They went back and forth with me a couple of times, asked me to take a video of the unit, send it through to them, and then I heard nothing for months. And so I'd shelved the Pegasus for ages, and it was only thanks to some assistance from John over at OAD Ultra Fidelity when I was chatting to him about the Padma preamp review. That's up on the channel if you want to see it. When I was chatting to him, I mentioned the Pegasus, we were talking DACs in general, and he offered to fix this for me. So I want to say a huge thanks to John for fixing this when Musician went completely silent and ghosted me. And that's also part of what I wanted to talk about with the Musician Pegasus, is that I am going to review it, but I want to make it really, really clear that, in my opinion, if you buy a Musician DAC based on my experiences and what I've heard around the web and on other reviews, you are kind of playing roulette with whether or not you're going to get service, a repair if you need it, what the warranty is going to be like. So do be aware of that one. I'm going to talk about its sound quality separate from any kind of warranty and device stability issues. But I also don't want to gloss over the fact that they absolutely just disappeared off the face of the planet when I needed support on this unit. So process that in whatever way you will. But for now, let's get into the review of the Schiit Bifrost 264, which is an $800 multi-bit DAC from Schiit. We've then got the Musician Pegasus here coming in at $1,100 US. That's an R2R DAC. We've then got the Denafrips Pontus II coming in at just over $1,700 US. It's another R2R DAC. And then finally, I've compared them also to the Schiit Yggdrasil OG. And that comes in at $2,599 US. And again, that's Schiit's multi-bit approach. So we've got 4 different DACs, none of them are Delta Sigma, and I was keen to see how they all sounded, how they differed, and where they were similar. And so without further ado, let's jump in and do some reviewing, starting off with a quick talk about some of the features and functions of the Musician Pegasus and the Denafrips Pontus II. If you want to know more about the Bifrost 2 or the Schiit Yggdrasil, I've got separate reviews on those, so make sure you check those out. I'm not going to talk at all about their inputs and outputs here, because I want to save that time for these two R2R DACs. And kicking off with the Pegasus is a nice compact DAC. It's very similar in size to the Denafrips Aries 2, for those familiar with that. But interestingly, it's got a lot of similarities to the Pontus 2 in terms of some design elements. And maybe this is true for the Aries 2 as well. I don't have the Aries 2 to compare. I reviewed it in the past, but I can't remember exactly how it looked. But one of the first things I noticed about the Pegasus was if you have a look at the top edge here, there's this interesting cutout here. And on the website, Musician claim that this is an M for musician. But curiously enough, if I put that down for a moment, if we look at the Pegasus, it's got the exact same cutout. And so I know some people before have said that the Pegasus is apparently an Aries 2 clone. Looking at this, I would say maybe it is, or maybe it's a Pontus 2 clone that's been shrunk down. I'm not entirely sure, but I have to say the combination of the lack of support from Musician and then also seeing some of the design choices and how similar they are. I'll show you a video here of the labeling on the back of the Pontus 2 and the labeling on the back of the Pegasus. There's just a bit too much of the Pegasus that reeks of it being a clone of the Denafrips devices. And then when you couple that with a lack of service, I do start to wonder if Musician are actually a bit of a dodgy company. Now, I have absolutely no evidence for what I'm saying here. It's purely based on gut instinct, experience, and what I'm seeing. But it's not unheard of in this industry for a manufacturer to have somebody that works there steal the IP, go set up their own company, and essentially just rehash the same designs with maybe a couple of slight tweaks to make it look different, and then sell it under their own brand. Everything I've heard and read anywhere says that the Denafrips customer service is nothing short of excellent, whereas the Musician customer service has been called out multiple times by both reviewers and general end users. And it just makes me wonder, it makes me a little bit uneasy about whether Musician are one of those companies where someone's either left Denafrips or maybe they've just copied one out of the box, they've looked at it, they've kind of recreated the circuit designs, and then maybe they're not properly set up with the infrastructure or the knowledge to support the product correctly. Again, I'm speculating wildly here, but I do want to raise these concerns. They're all on my mind and I wanted to share them with you. And so if we come back now to the functions and features, both devices, as I said, are pretty similar. So putting aside the slight aesthetic differences in terms of how they're laid out, on both devices you've got a power button, you've got a source selection button. In the case of the Pontus 2, I really like the fact that it's got a plus and a minus source, so you can go in either direction. You haven't got to cycle all the way around the different inputs. You can go just back a step or forward a step. And then both of them do also offer things like oversampling and non-oversampling. When we look at the back of the devices, things are again pretty similar. Both devices are balanced, so you've got XLR outputs and RCA outputs. And in fact, let me turn the Pegasus around so you can see this. I'm not going to try and turn around the Pontus 2. But you've got the RCA outs and the XLR outs. Both of them have those. The layout's slightly different, but the same things are there. And then in both cases, we've got a coaxial input for digital, optical, USB, AES, and I2S, which is great. Where things do differ a bit between the Pegasus and the Pontus 2 is that in the case of the Pontus 2, you've got a second AES output, and you've also got a BNC coaxial input as well. So you've got RCA and BNC for your SPDIFs, and then on here, you've only got RCA for your SPDIF. But other than that, they're very, very similar. So the decision is going to come down really to whether or not you want to spend more money on the Pontus 2, whether you're happy to run the gauntlet of the customer service issues with the Musician, and of course how they sound. And so let's jump straight to that and talk about sound quality. Listening to the Pegasus and the Pontus 2 in non-oversampling mode to start with, and I'll talk about oversampling in a moment. In non-oversampling mode, I felt like the Pontus 2 was just ever so slightly crisper and cleaner on transients, but otherwise they were very, very similar. The Pontus 2 does produce a better sense of depth and size in the soundstage overall, again not by a huge margin, but by a little bit. And the thing that really stood out to me as I listened to these is just how close the Pegasus is getting for the money. And that's where it did have me wondering if perhaps it is just a clone, slightly shrunk down, removed some inputs, but essentially a clone of the Pontus 2 rather than the Aries 2. I didn't particularly like the Denafrips Aries 2 when I reviewed it some years ago, but I do think the Pegasus sounds quite good if we put aside the issues. When I changed both DACs over to the oversampling mode, I felt similar differences carried through, but it probably became a little bit more pronounced. And what I mean by that is the Pegasus 2 got a little bit crisper on the transients, more so than the Pegasus 2 did. The Pegasus 2 stayed a bit more smooth. And for me, I preferred the sound of the Pontus 2 consistently between these two. It's not a huge margin, we're talking a few percent, but I did always prefer the Pontus 2. And so my starting point, which is just comparing these two R2R DACs, my starting point was to say that I think the Musician Pegasus, if it didn't have the customer service issues and potentially the reliability issues, if that wasn't the case, this comes very, very close to a Pontus II for much less money. So for just over $600 difference, you're almost getting the same sound out of the Pegasus that you get from the Pontus II. You've got a couple less inputs, but other than that, all the functionality is the same. So it is a real shame that they've got these issues with customer service and potentially reliability, because the sonic performance is fantastic. And so this is really what kicked off the whole comparison that we're about to go into now, was I started to then think, well, if you've got the Pegasus here, which is almost as good as the Pontus II, and costs only a little bit more than the Bifrost II, then how does it compare to the Bifrost II, both the Pegasus to the Bifrost II, but then also the Pontus II to that? And so I pulled out the Bifrost II, and then off we go with our comparisons. So starting off with the Bifrost 264, and that's running in oversampling mode because it also offers non-oversampling, but to me oversampling is clearly better. And so running the Bifrost 264 in oversampling mode and putting it up against the Pegasus also in oversampling mode, I tried both of them side by side, listening to Longing by Yoshi Horikawa. And what I heard starting with the Bifrost 2, because it's the cheapest DAC here, was a wonderful sense of space in this recording. There's also a great sense of clarity, and overall everything just sounded good from the Bifrost 264. Which, by the way, the Bifrost 264 is a new upgraded version of the Bifrost 2. It's the only version you can buy now if you're buying direct from Schiit. If you've got the original Bifrost 2, you can upgrade, and I've got a full video on that one. So check out that video if you want to know more about why I'm calling it the Bifrost 264. But the Bifrost 264 sounded fantastic on Longing by Yoshi Horikawa. When I moved over to the Pegasus, the first thing I noticed was that unfortunately, the Pegasus has a lower output level. And so it did take me a little bit of time. I had to do a bit of volume matching each time I switched between them, and that does make comparisons a touch more difficult. But once I got into the rhythm of it, what I found was that the Pegasus had slightly less controlled bass. There's a little bit more sense of looseness to the bass, and that results in a slight sense of greater thump or greater kind of presence in the bass. But whether or not it's actually accurate or just different is a whole nother question. So if you do like your bass to be a little bit looser, a little bit fuller, the Pegasus could be better than the Bifrost 2 for you. But it does come with some other differences as well, and the first one that I noticed was that the Pegasus is a bit less focused in its image. So with the Bifrost 264, you get a really nice, clean and precise image, whereas with the Pegasus, things just go a tiny bit out of focus. It's not bad by any stretch, but the Bifrost 2 is clearly better. In comparison to the Bifrost 2, I also felt like the Pegasus lacked a bit of kind of texture. So in some of the percussive sounds in Longing, there was a lack of clarity, a lack of texture. I felt like I was hearing the details of each sound better from the Bifrost 2 than I could from the Pegasus. And so if you're looking for a more relaxed sound in general, maybe you've got a system that's a bit aggressive, then certainly the Pegasus could give you a slightly more relaxed overall sound. It might be easier to listen to, a bit smoother and a bit more forgiving. But what I was finding was it was also draining the energy out of the music. And that's something I found with the Denafrips Aries 2 as well, was it didn't bring the energy that I wanted in the music. And that can be good or bad depending on your setup, as I said before. If you do have a very energetic, very kind of aggressive system, maybe you've got a pair of speakers that are extra dynamic, you may find something like the R2R DAC in the Pegasus to be beneficial. But for me, with my dedicated headphone rigs, I definitely prefer the Bifrost 2 over the Pegasus here. And I should add, the headphone amp I was using for all of this was the Burson Soloist 3X GT, which is a very, very clean, neutral, and dynamic sounding amp. And so at this point for me, I felt like the Bifrost 2 was clearly the better DAC when compared to the Pegasus. Again, that's based on my taste and my source chain, but I liked the fact that it had a bit more control in the bass. It didn't lose the sense of weight and punch, but it didn't have the same sense of looseness, which can make the Pegasus sound a bit fuller. I also preferred the sense of precision and focus that it brought to the image, and also the sense of clarity and energy in the sound as well. And so I pushed aside the Pegasus, even though it's a nice DAC for the money if you're looking for that smoother sound, and I moved on to put the Bifrost 264 up against the Denafrips Pontus II. One of the tracks I used for this comparison was What Happened to Love by Naya Azumi. Jumping between the Bifrost 2 and the Pontus II, what I noticed was that again the Pontus II had that slightly fuller sounding bass, the slightly slower, slightly looser sounding bass that gives a bit more sense of thump and a bit more fullness to the sound. Again, for better or worse, depending on your tastes. The Bifrost 2 also comes across a tiny bit more forward, so it's going to deliver the sound a little bit more intimately, but it's not a huge shift. It's like going from, say, the 5th row in the auditorium to moving forward to the 4th row. It's a very small shift, but a slight shift from the Bifrost 2, being a little bit closer to the sound. I once again felt like the Bifrost 264 was better in terms of resolution and detail compared to the Pontus II, but it does come at the cost again of that slightly more relaxed presentation from the Pontus II. And I think the Pontus II is doing a better job of balancing the relaxed sound with still a good sense of clarity and energy in the sound as well. It's not quite as smooth as the Pegasus, and so it does balance that trade-off a little bit better. There's a kick bass in this track, What Happened to Love, that is particularly evident for me at least after about the 2-minute mark I started to notice it. And what I found as I went between the Bifrost 2 and the Pontus 2 was that the Bifrost 2 kept a bit more control and it was a bit faster sounding, but the Pontus 2 gave it a bit more oomph, a bit more thump and a bit more body. So you tended to feel it more from the Pontus 2, whereas the Bifrost 264 was keeping it probably a bit more controlled. And again, it's one of those areas where I wouldn't say one was better or worse or right or wrong, they were just different. And some are going to love that sense of fullness in the bass that the Pontus 2 brings, while others might see it as not controlling things as well and therefore prefer the Bifrost 2. And so ultimately, after that comparison, where I was left was that for me, the Bifrost 264 sits right alongside the Pontus 2 in terms of performance. They're different in the sense that if you want a slightly more relaxed but still very high quality sound, then the Pontus 2 is going to be a great choice. But if you want to save some money and or if you want a slightly more detail-oriented, textural sort of sound, then the Bifrost 264 once again proved to me that it's absolutely incredible for its price. So I'm not for a second going to sit here and say that the Bifrost 264 is better than the Pontus 2, but I'm absolutely going to suggest that I think they do sit side by side and are very much comparable. And I know some of the R2R lovers out there are going to think that's blasphemy for me to say that. It's also one of those cases where we're talking about a DAC here that is half the price of the Pontus 2, and so that also made me double check myself multiple times. But no matter how many times I went back and forth between the two, I think they absolutely go toe to toe with one another. And I would personally have either one very happily in my system. Obviously from a price and size point of view, the Bifrost 2 is preferable. But if you want that R2R sound, if you want that slightly more relaxed, more easygoing sound that's still detailed, has a decent sense of texture and energy to it, but in a more relaxed overall delivery, then the Pontus 2 is fantastic. As I said before, I didn't particularly like the Aries 2 when I reviewed it, that being the kind of the lower level unit from the Pontus 2. But the Pontus 2 is a DAC that I would absolutely happily own. And so whilst I can't really recommend the Pegasus based on what I've already covered off, the Pontus 2 is one that I would very happily recommend. But that then led me to the question of how it compares to the more expensive, but still not crazy expensive, Schiit Yggdrasil OG. In my Bifrost 264 review, where I compared the Bifrost 264 with the Yggy OG, I felt like there was a good step between the Bifrost 2 and the Yggy OG. It wasn't a huge step, but a very clear step. And so I was curious to see, and this was kind of a sanity check for me, to see if the Pontus 2 against the Yggy OG, theoretically I should have heard a clear improvement to the Yggy OG because I'm putting the Pontus 2 on the same level as the Bifrost 2. And so I put the Yggy OG up against the Pontus 2, and one of the tracks I listened to was Your Power by Billie Eilish, starting with the Pontus 2 this time, and it sounded wonderful with this track. It was smooth, but still engaging. It didn't kind of muddy things up the way I felt like the Aries 2 did. It kept things having a bit of energy, a good sense of attack on the transients, but smooth and easy and enjoyable. When I went over to the Yggy OG, it came across clearly a more energetic sound. And again, that could be better or worse depending on your preferences and your system. One thing that I did feel like the Yggy OG did comfortably better in was that it extracts more fine details. And that's where the Yggy OG is better than both the Bifrost 2, but also now better than the Pontus 2 in my opinion. So you're spending about $700 or $800 more than the Pontus 2, but what you're getting for that is a more energetic sound, but a more detailed and textured sound. And I don't just mean that its presentation emphasizes the details, it was actually pulling out stuff that I wasn't hearing from the Pontus 2. And indeed I wasn't hearing from the Bifrost 2 either. This is another one of those cases where it's all going to come down to your preferences. But to give you some specifics using the track Your Power by Billie Eilish, when listening from the Yggy OG, I was hearing more texture from Billie Eilish's vocals. What I also found was the bass was both tighter and punchier from the Yggy OG as well. So this is kind of where, for me, the Schiit multibit approach in the Yggy OG has kind of caught up with and overtaken the quality of the bass from the Pontus 2. I really like the bass qualities from the Pontus 2 when compared to both the Pegasus and the Bifrost 2, but with the Yggy OG, it kind of overtakes. And that is to say that it's both tight and punchy, whereas the Pontus 2 for me has a bit of punch, but it doesn't have the tightness and the control that the Yggy OG has. And so overall, the Pontus 2 comes across a bit fuller, a bit slower sounding. And the end result for me is that the Yggy comes across sounding kind of more high-res. I don't mean high-res in the marketing sense of it. What I mean is I feel like I'm hearing more details, more textures, more information, but never in a harsh way. There wasn't a moment where I listened to the Yggy OG and thought, I want to go back to the Pontus II because the Yggy OG is going to be fatiguing. It was always done really smoothly, really cleanly, and it wasn't like going over to a Delta Sigma DAC where things can get aggressive and kind of in your face. So the Yggy OG for me is kind of like the perfect point between the Delta Sigma clarity and the R2R kind of smoothness and engagement. One other thing I should mention in case it's relevant to you is that once again, just like with the Bifrost 2 and the Pontus 2, I felt like the Yggy OG brought you just one seat further forward in the auditorium, so that a little bit closer to the musicians compared to the Pontus 2, which kept you a little bit further back, but both were really well spaced, had a good sense of overall spaciousness, soundstage size, imaging focus and location and separation of instruments. Both of those were excellent. And so at the end of all my comparisons, I was left with the conclusion that what I had in front of me here was 4 fantastic DACs. There is not a DAC in this stack from a pure sound quality point of view that I think is a bad choice. The Pegasus is doing an amazing job for its price and being an R2R DAC. I think personally it sounds significantly better than the Aries 2, but of course you're running the gauntlet there with the musician issues that I've already spoken about. And then that leaves us with the 3 others being the Bifrost 2, the Pontus 2 and the Yggy OG, and all 3 are excellent. I'd say if you're watching your budget and you like a slightly more energetic sound, then the Bifrost 2 is absolutely the best choice. Also, if you're short on space, you're absolutely going to go for the Bifrost 2. If though you want a more relaxed sound, maybe you've got an aggressive pair of speakers or a more aggressive pair of headphones and you want to tame it a little bit, then the Pontus 2 is absolutely fantastic. This is one of the first pure R2R DACs that I plugged in and really enjoyed. It didn't set my world on fire, it didn't have me suddenly wanting to go and buy one, but it's very, very nice to listen to. And then that brings us around to the Yggy OG, which is what I would say if you're looking for the maximum sound quality under say $3,000 and you don't want a Delta Sigma DAC, you want to keep a little bit of that kind of R2R multi-bit richness and fullness of sound, then that's where I think the Yggy OG is great. It's even bigger again than the Pontus 2, which is why it's not on my desk, so do be aware of that. And it's also a little bit limited on inputs. It doesn't have I2S, it doesn't have the double AES options, but it is generally pretty comparable to the Pontus 2. And so for me, I think all 3 are fantastic options. This is one of those reviews where I can't get to the end of it and say, here's a solid firm conclusion, because I think all of them have their place, all of them are different, and all of them have a reason to exist. And so hopefully what I have been able to do is give you some clarity as to which one is going to suit your preferences, your specific setup, and of course your budget and available space too. I'm very comfortable recommending all 3, being the Bifrost 2, the Pontus 2, and the Yggy, not so much the musician Pegasus for the reasons I've already discussed. And so I'll put some links down below where you can go through and check out each of them for yourself. As always, I hope you found the review useful. Hopefully it has been helpful in clarifying your decision-making process. And if it has been helpful or you've just generally enjoyed it, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.